In this video, we're going to talk about using objects, in particular, a little bit about coding them in Java, but a review from your textbook on, on using objects and the difference between those and classes. So what's the difference between an object and a class? Well, a class is a way of defining what an object can look like. So if you think about, say, something like the basic classes that we have, int, string, right? Things like that. You can say something is a string, but string is not a particular thing you can point to, right? So an object is an instance of one of those classes. And in this case, it's really, most of the time when we talk about objects, we're talking about things that we have defined ourselves, but they could be objects that are provided to us by the system as well, right? So here's an example of a very simple class that I've defined. Here the class is called student. It contains a string that holds the student's name, an integer that holds the student's ID, and a string that holds their email address. So we say that this little, this set of things, right, defines the class. But I can't ask you, what's the class's name, right? The class doesn't have a name. We don't get a name until we instantiate it, right? So an individual record might be something like this, right, where this particular instance has a name of Dan and an ID of that number and an email address associated with it. And so this is an instance of the class, right? They're related, obviously, but one is an instance of another, and we might define it using some code in Java. So we're going to make an instance variable, s1, right? Notice that s1 is a variable, and it has the type of student, right? Normally this would be something like int or string or whatever, right? And to initialize it, we're going to set it equal to a new student, right? And then once we do that, we can modify that instance by setting a name, setting an ID, setting an email address, right? And once we do that, we can do that multiple times, right? Maybe we call this guy Ivan is S2, this one is S1, right? And we can manipulate those independently, right? They're two separate copies. So if I said something like s2.name, it's going to print right. It's going to print the name of this instance. And if I update it, right, it's only going to update this name, not this one. Right? So they're completely independent versions or instantiations of a student. And objects are just like any other type, right? We can declare objects with any valid variable name. We can do whatever we need to do, but one of the cool things is we can store them in an array. So, for instance, say I wanted to have an array of student objects, right? And instead of having a separate variable s1 for this guy and a separate variable s2 for this guy, I now have an array, and I can keep them nice and neat, just like I did, just like we do with all arrays, right? And again, I can access this name, right? So in this case, I'm looking at this array. This is the name of the array, index 0 dot name. So the name inside that object. And what is it going to print? Well, it's going to print my name, right? So we can see that it's within an array. This is the array. And then once we get there, this type is student. And we know it has a dot name. Write that cleaner. Student type right? So we know it has a name. And non-static methods act on, so that leads us to methods and how the methods within a class will interact with stuff. So static methods act on the class, right? Which is sort of a high-level idea. And we'll get into exactly static versus non-static, but you have to remember that non-static methods are the ones that act on an instance. So in this case, I now have updated the class definition so that there's this method here that returns the email length, and it just returns email.length, right? Because email is a string, so it has .length as a method within it, which means given this guy here, if I run this last bit of code, what does it print? Well, it goes into S1 and runs this on the particular instance that it's in, so it prints one. Right? Notice that this method can't run unless it's within an instance of student, right? If that student hadn't been initiated, it wouldn't have any email address to run on. So that's sort of how non-static methods operate inside of an instance.